contradiction considering this is in the middle of the war and that the main chambers at Auschwitz were still under construction. In Hilberg's book on page 885, we see that at the time, the main chambers at Auschwitz hadn't even been finished being built. So was the writer an investigative reporter stationed in Europe with access to good information, or a high-up government official? Actually, the writer was a Jewish Hollywood scriptwriter named Ben Hecht. His Internet Movie Database entry is huge. This story in Reader's Digest brought the Holocaust story to the heartland of America for the first time, but his information includes incidences that never happened. Incidences that even Raoul Hilberg doesn't believe ever happened, the first three of which mention synagogues. This is the first incident Hecht gives. Remember us, in the town of Freiburg, in the Black Forest, 200 of us were hanged and left dangling out of our kitchen windows to watch our synagogue burn and our rabbi being flogged to death. Here's the second example given by Hecht. In Suszyn, in Poland, on the morning of September 23rd, which is the day set aside for our atonement, we were in our synagogue, praying God to forgive us. All our village was there. Above our prayers, we heard the sound of motor lorries. They stopped in front of our synagogue. The Germans tumbled out of them, torches in hand, and set fire to us. When we ran out of the flames, they turned machine guns on us. They seized our women and undressed them and made them run naked through the marketplace before their whips. All of us were killed before our atonement was done. Remember us. His third example, this is all on page 108. In Roklawek, also the Germans came when we were at worship. They tore the prayer shawls from our heads. Under whips and bayonets, they made us use our prayer shawls as mops to clean out German latrines. We were all dead when the sun set. Remember us. Even Raoul Hilberg doesn't believe these things happened. If you look up every reference to synagogues seen on page 1269 of Hilberg's 3-volume Destruction of the European Jews, he only mentions civilian mobs burning synagogues in 1938 with no one trapped inside. But propaganda involving synagogue desecration had an effect on Middle America in such a way as to make Americans pro-war. Or imagine a young airman involved with the bombing of a German residential suburb who felt it justified. He'd read the Reader's Digest article. So when we read about the synagogue curtain at the entrance to the gas chamber, what we may be seeing is an ill-fitting vestige of a certain type of war propaganda, of the sort that involves desecration of synagogues. But in this article we also see that a Hollywood scriptwriter predicted the 6 million deaths in the middle of the war. That's interesting. How could someone mention 6 million Jews in the middle of the war? Hecht writes, of these 6 million Jews, almost a third have already been massacred by the Germans, Romanians, and Hungarians, and the most conservative of the scorekeepers estimate that before the war ends, at least another third will have been done to death. If the most conservative estimate is that 2/3 will die, one could posit that the most liberal estimate would be that all 6 million will die, which might be why he writes that the Jews of Europe will have been reduced from a minority to a phantom. Ben Hecht got the 6 million number by taking the Jewish populations of various European countries and adding them up. It would seem that that would make sense. After all, if you knew the Jewish population of those countries, and if you feared that all would be killed, then you could just add up the numbers and predict how many would be killed and thus come up with 6 million. But here's the first problem with that. Hecht doesn't include enough countries. Hecht mentions 8 countries, which he tabulates to get 6 million. In contrast, Raoul Hilberg tabulates 17 countries on page 1048 and gets around 9 million. Here's problem 2. According to Raoul Hilberg, Ben Hecht's pre-war Jewish population figures are not correct. Hecht gives the pre-war German Jewish population at 900,000, whereas Hilberg has it at 240,000. Hecht puts the pre-war Jewish population of Hungary at 750,000, whereas Hilberg puts it at 400,000, and Hecht's pre-war Jewish population for Czechoslovakia, 150,000, but Hilberg puts it at 315,000. Our third problem with Hecht's tabulation is that according to Hilberg, all the Jews weren't killed. Some fled, some weren't rounded up, some hid, some emigrated, some left and then returned. For instance, for the 400,000 Jews in Hungary, 200,000 were still left after the war. For the 240,000 Jews in Germany, 80,000 were still there after the war. For the 270,000 Jews in France, 200,000 still remained after the war. So Hecht uses all sorts of wrong information and methodology, yet his article, which first brought the Holocaust story to mainstream America, also has the 6 million number in it. Hecht was part of a militant Jewish organization called the Irgun. In fact, when the Germans lost the war, Hecht then turned his writing skills toward the British in Palestine. At the Wyman Institute website, we see that Hecht wrote a play called A Flag is Born, the purpose of which was to stir up anti-English sentiment in America and raise money for the Jewish fighters in Palestine. We read, "In the play's dramatic final moments, David delivers a stirring Zionist speech and marches off to fight for Jewish freedom in the Holy Land, holding a makeshift Zionist flag fashioned from Tevye's prayer shawl." There's the prayer shawl again, just like in the Reader's Digest article. And by the way, in the play, the character David is a Treblinka survivor. He is the one that held the makeshift Zionist flag fashioned from a prayer shawl. His role was played by Marlon Brando. Hecht even took out anti-English advertisements in newspapers. He wrote in one such ad excerpted at the Wyman Institute website, "In the past 1,500 years, every nation of Europe has taken a crack at the Jews," Hecht wrote. "This time the British are at bat. You," referring to the Jews fighting the British in Palestine, "are the first answer that makes sense to the New World. Every time you blow up a British arsenal, or wreck a British jail, or send a British railroad train sky high, or rob a British bank, or let go with your bombs at the British betrayers and invaders of your homeland, the Jews of America make a little holiday in their hearts." When the English conflict was over, he turned his writing and theatric skills toward the Jewish Israeli government, if you can believe that, because they had not taken as much Arab land as Hecht would have liked. When the Irgun, the group Hecht was part of, tried to bring a ship full of weapons into Israel in 1948 to be used on the Arabs, the new Israeli government sunk the ship, which was called the Altalena. Hecht later wrote about this incident in a lamenting style strangely similar to the Reader's Digest article. The Jewish government had called for the Irgun to help it stay alive against 5 enemy armies, but they would never dare welcome an Altalena loaded with enough arms to rescue beleaguered Jerusalem or to enable an army of victorious young Hebrews to sweep through Eretz Israel and win land on both sides of the Jordan. There would be no Hebrew nation, no room for cattle and grain, no cities, no freight yards, no ancient capital revived, no space for industry or destiny. There would be a beachhead called Israel, to which the Jews could cling as they had always clung, like castaways. In short, the people of Middle America trusted publications like Reader's Digest. The vast majority did not have the skepticism and discernment to question it or writers as clever as Hecht. And the 6 million number? That was the number thrown out by the storytellers before the supposed fact happened. We'll look at 2 problems regarding airflow in the gas chambers. First, the gas chambers are described as having a very low ceiling. On page 74 of a RAD, we see the testimony of Belsec escapee Rudolf Rieder, who says that the ceiling was just 2 meters high, which is 6.5 feet. The problem with that height is that everything is within reach of the people inside the chamber. They could block the pipe that pours exhaust into the room by pushing their hands against the opening, or by stuffing a towel into the pipe, since it's often claimed they were given towels. The second problem is that if you have a pipe pouring exhaust into a hermetically sealed room, you also need another pipe to let the air that's already in the room escape. Yet nowhere in Arad or Hilberg could I ever find a mention of a second pipe. Ironically, the one person to mention a second pipe is Yankel Wernick in his book A Year in Treblinka on page 14. Notice the words inlet and outlet for flushing out the fresh air. I almost found the presence of two pipes mentioned in Arad. He mentions an early test gassing of the insane on page 10. Two doctors are involved. Dr. Widman of the Criminal Police, who consults Dr. Heese, director of the Criminal Police Technological Institute. And here's how they do it. In the local lunatic asylum, a room with 20 to 30 of the insane was closed hermetically, and two pipes were driven into the wall. This looks correct, one to let the exhaust in, and one to let the air that's already in the room out. But watch what happens at the end. After 8 minutes, the people in the room were still alive. A second car was connected to the other pipe in the wall. The two cars were operated simultaneously, and a few minutes later all those in the room were dead. So much for physics. They blocked their outtake pipe, which is necessary for the experiment to work properly. The storytellers figured that two intake pipes would work better than one outtake pipe and one intake pipe. The storytellers are good at vilifying the Germans, but not so good with physics, chemistry, and common sense, which is revealed with the experiments that they claim the Germans conducted. Here's one just above on the same page, and it's really ridiculous. Dr. Widman and Arthur Neeb are investigating the possibility of killing millions of Jews with explosives. Here's their experiment. 25 mentally ill people were locked into two bunkers in a forest outside Minsk. The first explosion killed only some of them, and it took much time and trouble until the second explosion killed the rest. Explosives, therefore, were unsatisfactory. Yeah, especially considering that the explosions would take a toll on the bunker as well, or blow it up, and imagine the mess. And another hint that this is a made-up story from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, the amount of explosives they brought with them, 400 kilograms, which is nearly 900 pounds. And historian Raoul Hilberg believes this story too. It's on page 333 of his book. Here's an experiment to get rid of tens of thousands of bodies. Just open the pit and throw an incendiary bomb on top of the bodies. That should make them all disappear. Such is the hypothesis of the experiment. We read in Arad on page 171, the pits were opened and the first experiments were carried out. Incendiary bombs were tried, but these caused large fires in the surrounding woods. Multiple large fires in the surrounding woods. Okay. Hilberg believes this too on page 977 of his book. After a gassing, all the bodies would first be hauled out of the rooms into a pile just outside the building. From there they would be hauled to the outlying burial pits. We can see in Arad that on some days 12,000 people were gassed in this building at Treblinka. At 100 pounds each, which is 45 kilos, that is 1,200,000 pounds of bodies to be hauled to the pits in just one day, or 544,000 kilos. Now consider that during the war, Germany was the only country to have operational jet aircraft, and was miles beyond any country in rocket science. Considering that, what mechanized industrial process did they use to haul these daily 1,000,000 pounds of bodies to the pits? Well, the prisoners dragged the bodies by their feet to the ditches. That's Arad, page 87. Or the Germans fixed upon stretchers as the fastest way. 2 men carried the stretcher, which looked like a ladder with leather carrying straps. That's Arad, page 111. Or we can look in Yankel Wernick's book, page 10. He says that the work was hard because we had to drag a corpse in teams of 2 for a distance of approximately a quarter of a mile. That's 402 meters. At times we tied ropes around the dead bodies to pull them to their graves. So we're supposed to believe that the country that came up with the first operational jet aircraft decides upon design solutions for Treblinka that predate the invention of the wheel. What we're really seeing is the recurring theme of the storytellers thinking they know how the Germans would have done it. In other words, Wernicke and others figured they knew how the German industrial engineers would have set things up. At Treblinka, Belsec, and Sobibor, an estimated 1.38 million bodies were allegedly buried underground. The problem is that there isn't enough burial space on the maps and models for that many bodies. To show this, we'll figure out how much space one body would take. Then we'll multiply that number by 1.38 million. That will give us the total space needed to bury all the bodies. Keep this 3D image in mind as we look at page 112 in Yitzhak Arad's book, which is called Belsec, Sobibor, Treblinka. After the victims' bodies were thrown into a pit by the body transport workers, the corpses were arranged in rows by the burial detail. To save space, the bodies were arranged head to foot. Each head lay between the feet of two other corpses, and each pair of feet between two heads. Sand or chlorine was scattered between the layers of bodies. Approximately half the team worked inside the ditches arranging the corpses at the same time that the other half was covering a layer of bodies with sand. When a ditch filled up, it was topped off with earth and a new ditch was opened. Arad is saying that each layer looked something like this configuration. To estimate how much space one body would take, we'll choose an average height of 5 feet per person, or 1.52 meters. This height would account for men, women, and children, but notice that the head overlaps with the feet. Due to this overlap, we need to take off 10 inches, or 25.4 centimeters. So the length we end up using for the average height is 4 feet 2 inches, or 1.27 meters. For width, we use 26 inches, or 66.04 centimeters, which includes any small space between the bodies. For depth, we use 9 inches, or 22.86 centimeters for the body, but Arad mentions that half the crew worked at covering the bodies with a layer of sand, so we'll add 7 inches for that, or 17.78 centimeters. So the total depth is 16 inches, or 40.64 centimeters. Get a ruler or tape measure and see how these numbers compare to your own body. Multiplying the numbers we just came up with, we get 0.3408 cubic meters per body. Then we take that number and multiply it by the total amount buried to get 470,304 cubic meters. This is our estimation of the total burial space for 1.38 million people. Now let's see what Arad says about the pits that the bodies were buried in. On page 42 he writes regarding Treblinka. East of the gas chambers and close to them were huge ditches for burying the dead. The ditches were 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, and 10 meters deep. You're about to see a 3D model of the pit with the lengths Arad mentioned. As you can see, it is a huge pit. The length and width happen to be the same as a regulation Olympic swimming pool. Few swimming pools are that big. Not everyone has even seen one. Around 4 fit onto the area of a football field. But as you can see, the pits that we are talking about are much deeper than an Olympic swimming pool. If we multiply length times width times height, we get the cubic meters of this pit. We'll use 9 meters for height since Arad mentions that the top layer of the pit was dirt only. Each pit is 11,250 cubic meters. Let's create some space on this screen. We just figured out the cubic meters per pit. So how many pits would it take to hold all the bodies? 41.8. How many bodies could each pit hold? Each pit could hold around 33,000 bodies. One last passage before we look at a map. Arad writes on page 173, "The last camp where cremation of the corpses was instituted was Treblinka. During Himmler's visit to the camp at the end of February, beginning of March 1943, he was surprised to find that in Treblinka the corpses of over 700,000 Jews who had been killed there had not yet been cremated. Two things to notice here: the 700,000 number, and that Himmler's visit was at the end of February, beginning of March 1943. Here's the map. Notice it says spring 1943. Here's the gas chamber, and here are the cremation grills. Here are the burial pits that we've been talking about. The map has no distance key, but Arad has mentioned that this water well was 20 meters from this barracks fence. This makes the pits seem a little smaller than 50 by 25 meters, but we'll say this is one full-sized pit. Here's two. We'll say this is a third, and these two make up 4. So the question you got to ask yourself is, where are the 17 other pits? For this map to be accurate, it should look something like this. There should be 21 pits. Even if you halved this number to 20.3 centimeters or 8 inches, you would still need 10.6 pits for Treblinka. What about the possibility that the pits were deeper, or that they buried the bodies outside the camp perimeter, or that they buried the bodies in other parts of the camp? The entire evidence that Treblinka existed is based on eyewitness accounts. The prisoners who worked in the killing operations section slept here in the prisoners' barracks. They worked in this area nearly every day for up to a year before they escaped. They would have known the space well. These aren't possibilities, for one, because the witnesses don't say they are. Plus, on a website called deathcamps.org, we see various Treblinka models that have burial spaces and layouts similar to Arad's map. Here's the 2004 Laponder model. Here's the camp perimeter. Here's the killing operations area. Here's the gas chamber. Here are the pits. Here's the Peters model. Here's the camp perimeter, the killing operations area, the gas chamber. Here are the pits. It doesn't look like there's the equivalent to the area of 21 regulation Olympic swimming pools on these models either. So the problem isn't with Arad's map, since these models roughly correspond to it. The problem is that the people who made up this story didn't realize how much space 700,000 bodies would really take. They thought a few large pits would suffice. Arad estimates the total death toll for Sobibor at 250,000. Regarding burying the corpses, Arad writes on page 177, only 1/3 of the 250,000 victims in this camp had been killed and buried there before the cremating began. Those who were gassed there afterward, in the period between October 1942 and October 1943, were taken directly from the gas chambers to the cremating sites. So 1/3 of 250,000 is how many were buried. That is 83,000. That's way less than at the other camps, but keep in mind that's not far from the amount of spectators that can fill the Pasadena Rose Bowl during the Rose Bowl game. So how much space on the Sobibor map is shown for burying 83,000 people? We look on page 35. There isn't a defined set of pits like on the other two maps. Number 54 is described as mass graves and outdoor crematoria. So they were buried somewhere in here. A lot of space is needed, but instead we're told it's somewhere in here. This is vague, so let's go to deathcamps.org again. We're looking at it in summer 2005. We can click on models to get a model of Sobibor, and go to the Blatt model based on alleged survivor Thomas Toivy Blatt. It's quite similar to Arad's map when turned sideways. Here's the tube in Arad's map, and here's the tube in the Blatt model. Arad puts trees here, and Blatt puts a lawn, but in both we see a barbed wire fence here. Here's the extermination area. Here's the gas chamber. Here's the cremation grill. So just like on Arad's map, they buried the bodies maybe here and here. Deathcamps.org has a color close-up of the model in the area we want to see. The shot is from roughly where you see this camera here. Here it is. Here's the gas chamber, here's the grill, and here's the fence. So just like on Arad's map, they buried the bodies maybe here and here. They buried roughly the equivalent to the stadium spectators of the Rose Bowl game here and here. This looks more like the area for burying 80 bodies, not 80,000. Here's another view. They buried 80,000 bodies here and here.
Be seen, the Longhorns, the visiting team, Michigan will be the home team, and they will wear...
Here's another map of Sobibor, also from deathcamps.org. This one was used at the Hagen, West Germany Sobibor trial in the 1960s. Here's the tube. This map describes the burial area as amongst a coniferous forest. Coniferous trees are trees that bear cones and needle-like leaves. This is hard to read, but it says mass grave, and this says mass grave. They correspond roughly to the areas we were just pointing to on the Blatt model and on the map in Arad's book. This text is hard to read also, but it says hen house. It's not much smaller than the burial pits on the map. This map was used as evidence in the trial where Karl Frenzel was sentenced to life in prison. Can you imagine getting sentenced to life in prison based on evidence where the space they give for burying 80,000 bodies are 2 pits, not much bigger than the hen house?
Oh, that's it. We're out of time again. This is the John Savers Variety Spotlight Show. My name is John Savers. I'm your host. I certainly appreciate your tuning in. Do join us again next time.